Alexander the Great, the Prince of remote Macedonia, one of the most extraordinary and enigmatic warriors of all time, who would embark on the conquest of the entire known world, from the Mediterranean to India, and by the age of 30 had already managed to invade more than half of the terrestrial sphere, erecting the greatest empire in history. A man who considered himself a god, and who in his short life walked a fine line between genius and madness, who had an influence on history that few people have achieved, and who changed the ancient world forever. Join us in exploring in this episode the astonishing, complete story of a man who, in his short life of 32 years, achieved a historical immortality that makes us still talk about him today, more than 2,000 years later. The Grand Conqueror, Alexander the Great. More than 2,000 years ago, in Pella, in northern Greece, there stood the palace of Philip II, King of Macedonia, the father of Alexander the Great. This was the home of the most important warrior in history. Alexander became a Macedonian warrior at the age of 14. He became a general at 18, king at 20. And at the age of 30, he was already ruling one of the largest empires ever known. He conquered in 12 years 40,000 kilometers, covering the territories of what is now Greece, Turkey, Lebanon, Egypt, Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. Was he a military genius? Or a bloodthirsty tyrant? Alexander was both and perhaps neither. A man who lived only to the age of 32, but who achieved historical immortality. In Macedonia, northern Greece, in 356 BC, Alexander, son of King Philip II, was born. Macedonia was considered by the Athenians as a land of barbarians. It was not on a cultural and political level the same as the rest of Greece. All Greek polis had their own idiosyncrasies. But Macedonia, in addition, was a kingdom. The king had absolute power, political, military, and religious. They had archaic values in the eyes of the rest of Greece. But also, Macedonia was the land of great historical figures such as the philosopher Aristotle. Macedonia was also a land of great wealth. They controlled an area full of gold and silver mines. Philip II was the king who turned an impoverished kingdom despised by Athens and Sparta into the great hegemonic power of all Greece. Faced a military reform of the Macedonian armies with the aim of being able to subdue the great Greek cities. The Macedonian phalanx, an adaptation of the traditional Greek phalanx, was Philip's most powerful instrument of war. With thousands of 5-meter-long spears, the Macedonian army was a war machine on the move, virtually unstoppable. In the midst of his conquering maelstrom, the Macedonian king decided to marry in 357 BC the Princess Olympias of Epirus. She would be the mother of Alexander, who would be born in 356. Alexander led a princely life, but his ambition and curiosity for the world was boundless. By this time, the troops of Philip II were busy expanding the kingdom. In 343 BC, Philip summoned Aristotle to tutor his 13-year-old son. Aristotle, Plato's disciple, taught Alexander to think like a Greek, but to fight like a barbarian. He taught him to write also in Hebrew, Babylonian, and Latin. He taught him justice and rhetoric. When Alexander was young, he was taught to fight and ride by Leonidas of Epirus, a relative of his mother Olympias. A woman very involved in mystical cults and mythology, to the point that Philip began to fear her, thought that Olympias was communicating with a higher being. Olympias' main interest throughout her life was to see Alexander on the throne. Athens and the other Greek city-states saw Macedon as a threat. In the 338 BC, an alliance of Greek polis, composed mainly of Athens and Thebes, would confront the Macedonian army. They clashed in the city of Chaeronea, in Boeotia. This battle is considered one of the most decisive of the ancient world. The armies of Athens and Thebes were annihilated and could not continue their resistance. Thus the war came to an abrupt end. In this battle, Alexander demonstrated great military prowess. Despite being only 18 years old, he helped turn the tide of the battle in a decisive Macedonian victory, which defeated the Greek allied cities. After the war, Philip summoned all the delegates of the city-states to Corinth. They formed an alliance, which forbade the Greeks to fight each other, and there they would also agree to attack Persia together. During the 24 years of his reign as King of Macedonia, Philip built his own kingdom and made it the greatest power in Europe. For the first time, all of mainland Greece was ruled by one man. Philip also planned the overthrow of the Persian Empire, landed forces in Asia, and was in the act of liberating the Hellenic communities when he was interrupted by fate. In 336 BC, Philip was assassinated. No doubt Olympias must have planned it, perhaps with Alexander's complicity. His son Alexander assumed the throne as Alexander III, also bequeathing a military establishment of great size and quality. Alexander had anyone who might dispute his throne executed. With the Greek city-states united under Macedonian rule after Chaeronea, Alexander embarked on the great campaign his father had been planning: the conquest of the mighty Persian Empire. But before launching into the conquest of the Persian Empire, Alexander retraced his father's steps to cross Thessaly, destroy Thebes, and force Athens to recognize his supremacy, making himself hegemon, a title that placed him as ruler of all Greece. In all these cities, they had arms, soldiers, and money from Persia. The Persian king, Darius III, knew that if Macedonia culminated in the conquest of Greece, the next target would be Persia. After Alexander had secured internal peace, he could focus on external affairs. Alexander decided to see his success as ordained by divine forces. He called himself the son of Zeus and claimed demigod status, linking his lineage to his two favorite heroes of antiquity, Achilles and Hercules. and modeling his behavior on theirs. His belief in his divinity was instilled in him by his mother Olympias. After he had punished the powerful city of Thebes after its revolt and destroyed it by killing 6,000 people and making the more than 30,000 survivors be sold as slaves, Alexander had managed to subdue the rest of Greece based on threats. They would never again revolt against him. From there, Alexander was ready to terrorize the rest of the known world. Alexander then turned his attention to what would become the goal of his life: the conquest of Persia and the defeat of the most powerful ruler on earth, King Darius III. The largest empire in the world at the time, it stretched across 3 continents, from present-day Turkey to Pakistan. 150 years earlier, the Persians had burned the city of Athens and destroyed its temples. This war crime was never forgotten. Alexander then leaves Troy for Persia, the ancient enemy of Greece. In 334 BC, one of the greatest invasions in history would begin. After a logistical maneuver of enormous proportions, Alexander moved his troop of 40,000 soldiers, and after crossing the Hellespont, the strait that separates Europe from Asia, they marched on the territory of present-day Turkey. They crossed the Hellespont in a variety of rowing boats. On the other side of the strait, the army of the Persian king Darius, which was 3 times larger, was waiting for them. The current of the Hellespont is strong, and the winds can be brutal. Alexander's ships could be very vulnerable to naval attack while transporting the army. But Alexander had 2 lucky breaks. The weather was good, and the huge Persian fleet at the time was far away, quelling a revolt in Egypt. The beachhead for Alexander's great invasion is the city of Troy, scene of legendary battles between Greeks and Trojans. There, on the banks of the Granicus River, he encounters a Persian army destined to halt his advance. A large number of Persian troops are concentrated on the other side of the river. 20,000 horsemen and 20,000 infantry, many of them Greek mercenaries. Scythian archers and heavy cavalry from Hyrcania and Bactria. The Persian ruler chooses not to waste time commanding the troops himself, and instead sends his most trusted general, Memnon of Rhodes, a Greek mercenary. He also chose a battlefield where the terrain would play in his favor, the Granicus River. The river was in full flow, and its steep and slippery banks presented a formidable obstacle. The Persians were confident that Alexander would not attack in the afternoon. But the young Macedonian king had faith in the readiness of his army to meet such a challenge. Alexander proceeded to organize his army for a bold attack that many military leaders might consider foolhardy. Thousands of highly trained soldiers on foot and horseback would boldly cross the river. And they would meet the Persians. Alexander would lead his cavalry to attack the enemy on the right flank. This marks the first time Alexander achieves victory using traditional tactics. They surround 3,000 soldiers and annihilate them. It was a massacre. 2,000 soldiers surrender, but Alexander sells them as slaves. In the battle, Alexander loses less than 200 troops. Alexander's victory at Granicus allows his army to continue its invasion of Persia. He first takes control of key ports on the Aegean Sea. From there, he leads his army to the city of Gordium, which offers no resistance. The walled city of Gordium, which 400 years earlier had been the city of King Midas, was a key link to the heart of the Persian Empire. But the most difficult tests for Alexander's army were yet to come. Persian King Darius III. This time he put himself at the head of an army of great dimension that was heading for the city of Issus. With an army of more than 100,000 men, Darius advanced towards Asia Minor, towards the city of Issus, in an attempt to attack the Greeks by surprise from the rear. If Darius managed to reach the Gulf of Issus, he could use the support of the Persian fleet still operating in the Mediterranean, facilitating his supply, and probably landing troops in his rear. For his part, after spending a year securing the conquest of the Anatolian Peninsula, territory of present-day Turkey, Alexander began his offensive to the south, with the purpose of neutralizing the dangerous Persian fleet, capturing its ports. Already located in Issus, Alexander decided to regroup his dispersed army and advance southward to wait there for the Persian army. But Darius moves his army northward, reaches Issus, and there, they kill all the wounded Alexander had left behind in the city. The Persian king found that his army had positioned itself behind the Macedonians, cutting their supply lines. He then advanced southward. Alexander had no choice but to reverse his direction and march north. He was in a very precarious strategic situation, as he had been surprised by a much larger enemy. His possible route of retreat had been cut off, and to his rear he had the city of Phoenicia. Phoenicia, which was potentially hostile, and had not submitted to Alexander's authority. In November of 333 BC, when Alexander finds his enemy waiting on the other bank of the river Pinarus, at its mouth to the Mediterranean, with the coast to the east and the hills to the west, he realizes that the narrow battlefield was going to prevent Darius from exploiting his numbers to outflank his army. The Macedonian king was to face a Persian army, over 70,000 strong, that outnumbered his army. But this was the kind of challenge Alexander liked. Alexander halted his army several hundred yards before the river. There he was able to assess the situation in the blink of an eye. Alexander's ability to adapt is the characteristic trait of the greatest generals in military history. Then he quickly devised a plan with which he overcame obstacles that would appear insurmountable to any other high command. This was a critical event for Alexander. The Battle of Issus was pivotal to Alexander's conquest of Asia. Alexander was preparing to do what he knew best: anticipate, react, and adapt. He felt no fear. He was one of the few people in history who acted with supreme confidence. He gave a speech, emphasizing how superior the Macedonians were in the art of war, unlike the enemy. Alexander then makes his first move, using one of the most powerful weapons in his arsenal: the weapon of fear. Clashing their shields, they moved their spears from side to side and advanced to meet them with an incredible, chilling, and unending scream as they approached. It was terrifying. The legendary Macedonian phalanx and infantry are engaged in the bloodiest of hand-to-hand combat. The only chance for Macedonian victory lies with the cavalry led by Alexander himself. Alexander crosses the river and rides up the other bank. In the ensuing chaos, the Persians' left plan crumbles. When Alexander finally comes face to face with his adversary, he first pierces the bodyguard with his spear. Darius, when he sees his royal bodyguard being cut to pieces, turns his chariot around and runs for his life. When the Persian army sees their great king running away like that, they crumble. From that very moment, the battle was won. However, Alexander was relentless. At the end of the day, more than 50,000 men lay dead. For Alexander, the victory at Issus was a dramatic turning point. He had defeated the greatest army in the world, led by the most powerful ruler of the time. From there, Alexander continues his conquest of the seaports of Asia. Phoenicia and Cyprus easily came under his control. The Macedonian king was convinced that he would achieve the same in Tyre. But despite Alexander's enormous military power, the inhabitants of the city who thought they were safe on their fortified island were defiant. They were confident that Persian control of the sea and the weakness of Alexander's fleet would enable them to successfully oppose the new conqueror. On the other hand, they knew that if Darius, who was gathering a huge army in Mesopotamia, was victorious, he would punish severely those who had betrayed him. But Alexander's attitude towards resistance was to submit or die. Apart from being an insult to his crown, the challenge of Tyre would be an example to all those who opposed him. The conquest of such an impregnable fortress would considerably weaken the will to resist in the territories to be conquered. Alexander wished to control Tyre due to its strategic location. Controlling the island of Tyre meant controlling its vast naval port. Tyre was located 700 meters from the coast, with a walled perimeter 4.4 kilometers long and 45 meters high. To the 9,000 defenders were added 80 warships, against which Alexander could do little. So he decided to build an embankment of rocks and earth, connecting the island to the coast so that he could use his veteran troops in a conventional siege. Alexander then began what would become the longest and most brutal siege of his campaign. When the walls finally fall after 7 bloody months, he eliminates 7,000 men and enslaves another 30,000. The aftermath is terrifying. Alexander sacks the city, murders 8,000 citizens and crucifies 1,000 soldiers. Alexander's brutality, raping women, urging on all the prisoners shocks all of Asia. Such consternation and associated psychological effects induce multiple cities to immediately open their gates and submit to Alexander, rather than drag out the defeat and massacre. The message is blunt. Don't mess with Alexander. It was a horrible display of brutality, but it was also highly effective because it showed any potential enemy what could happen if they resisted. After conquering Tyre, his army marches south and into Gaza. In another savage siege, Alexander's army annihilates every man in the city. After 3 years of fighting, the Alexandrian Empire occupied 650,000 square kilometers, 5 times the size of present-day Greece, and Alexander was only 23 years old. After this series of savage victories under his belt, Alexander was ready to take Egypt. After 2 years of war, Alexander marches inland to Memphis. The Egyptians are impatient to see their Persian rulers defeated. They surrender without putting up a fight and welcome Alexander with open arms. The Egyptians offer Alexander the title of Pharaoh. It is here that Alexander begins to believe that he really is a living god. Then, north of Memphis, in the year 332 before our era, Alexander founds the first of 30 cities that would bear his name: Alexandria. Alexandria would become the new emporium for world trade. A cornerstone for Alexander's empire. Subsequently, he begins an epic journey to visit the Oracle of Siwa. He was looking for proof of his divine existence. Alexander entered the temple alone, while his men waited outside. When Alexander came out of the temple, he would have claimed at that moment that the oracle had confirmed to him that he was the son of Zeus. The Egyptians would confirm the idea that Alexander was a god on earth, depicting his image on the walls of some of their most sacred temples. Being divine, he was immune to criticism. He was on a different plane. But all this was not enough for Alexander, who was ready to defeat once and for all his secular enemy, Darius III. In 331 BC, Alexander returned to Tyre, where he received news of trouble in Greece. King Agis of Sparta, with Persian support, launched a revolt against Macedonia. Antipater, Alexander's commander in Greece, marched south and confronted Agis. But even the legendary Spartans were no match for Macedonian military power. The Spartan army was crushed. With Greece secured once again, Alexander focused on accomplishing his next objective, defeating Darius III in a decisive battle. Alexander, he knew, could never claim to be the ruler of Asia without defeating Darius III. And Darius III knew that he would not regain control of Asia without defeating Alexander. It was clear to both commanders that a final showdown had to take place. Darius chooses the location. He encamped his forces near the banks of the Bumotos River, near the town of Gaugamela and present-day Mosul in Iraq. Darius had chosen to fight in an open field where his numerical advantage would be present. This time the Persians tripled in number Alexander's forces. This was Darius's last chance to stop Alexander. The Persian army consisted of approximately 80,000 soldiers, made up of men from all over the empire. He had also built 200 scythe chariots, well designed to amaze and terrify the enemy. On the night of September 30th, 331 BC, the armies were stationed on the battlefield, prepared for confrontation. Alexander was engaged in a reconnaissance of the terrain and planning for the battle, and knowing that Darius was the one who had to defend the position, he ordered his troops to rest, while Darius, nervous for fear of a night attack, ordered the guard position for his soldiers. During the morning of that key day, Alexander gave his troops the pep talk of their lives, telling them confidently that this battle would decide who would rule the continent of Asia. On the other side of the battlefield, the Persian king Darius was also giving a speech, but his mood was more one of despair than confidence. Slowly but methodically, Alexander's phalanx advanced in formation. The battle began when Alexander turned his wing to the right, a move that took the Persians by surprise. Alexander's sudden and fierce attack caused panic among the Persian lines. The center of the army broke and fled, with King Darius himself leading the disorderly retreat. But Alexander's left flank was in serious trouble. Parmenion and his troops were resisting a major Persian cavalry onslaught. Darius's new rolling weapons, scythed chariots in full gallop action, created terror and heavy casualties among the Macedonians. Alexander's soldiers found themselves for the first time fighting not to win, but simply to survive. They were practically surrounded. Parmenion realizes that there is only one person who has the ability to turn the tide of battle: Alexander himself. But Alexander was preoccupied personally fighting his way to King Darius's chariot. The Macedonian king had to abandon the pursuit of Darius, regroup, and charge against the Persian right wing. It was the hardest and bloodiest engagement of the battle. Alexander seizes the opportunity and advances to attack Darius. The Persian king flees again. As news of Darius's flight spread across the battlefield, the last Persian horseman turned and fled. The Battle of Gaugamela was a complete and great victory for Alexander. He lost only a few hundred men, while the Persians lost thousands. Having been on military campaign for 5 consecutive years, Alexander ruled the largest world empire in history, and he was only 25 years old. Alexander had defeated the great army of Darius and was now on his way to Babylon, the capital of the empire. The Macedonian king entered the city with a triumph, being recognized by the Persian officials as the new legitimate ruler. Alexander is the undisputed ruler of Persia. He is, for certain, the most powerful man in the world. But power had gone to his head, and he would end up paying for his arrogance. In the year 330 BC, Alexander reached Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the empire. He wished to appear to the Persians as a liberator, a legitimate successor to King Darius. But now, he had ordered the pillage and destruction of the city in retribution for the Persian invasion of Greece, where the sacred temples of Athens were burned in 480 BC. In addition, Alexander wanted Babylon to be the capital of the empire, not Persepolis. Therefore, destroying Persepolis would eliminate the risk of the emergence of any kind of opposition in that city. Alexander then headed north, to Media, where Darius had taken refuge in the royal city of Ecbatana. Alexander was determined to capture Darius. But the Persian king was assassinated by one of his governors, Bessus, who proclaimed himself the new emperor. In the year 329 BC, Alexander continued to advance into Afghanistan to conquer the eastern end of the Persian Empire. His goal was to find and assassinate the usurper Bessus, subjugate the eastern provinces of the empire, and reach the far end of the world. The truth is that Alexander had not traveled those thousands of kilometers alone. He had embarked on this Asian adventure in the company of good childhood friends, like Ptolemy, Craterus, Cletus, and the loyal Hephaestion, but also in the company of those who really contributed to the triumph of the young king, the experienced Macedonian generals who had already loyally served his father Philip, such as Parmenion and Philotas. By this time, Alexander had already adopted Eastern customs and was acting as an autocrat, tolerating less and less criticism. All of this displeased the Macedonians, giving rise to tensions and plots. During that year, Alexander performs an unexpected act for the rest of his retinue of Macedonians and Greeks. Accusing Philotas of plotting against him, Alexander had him executed. Before Parmenio, Philotas's father, could learn of his son's death and potentially rebel, Alexander had him executed as well. The following year, at a banquet held in Samarkand in 328 BC, Alexander himself put an end to the life of Cletus, because the latter reproached him unreservedly for his attitude and his recent orientalizing policies. In 327, at the age of 29, he does something that is so out of place that it surprises even his closest associates. He marries Roxana of Bactria. This allows Alexander to achieve an alliance with the local nobility, and furthermore, the possibility of having a legitimate heir for his vast empire. It was the year 326 BC. After Alexander had conquered the Persian Empire, his new goal was to conquer the rest of Asia. It was believed that the end of the known world was in the mysterious and exotic lands of India. He then demanded that his people follow him to the end of the world, to a place where no Greek had ever been. The emperor discovered that he could cross the Hindu Kush through an ancient mountain pass, the Khyber. Alexander then decided to take on the towering peaks of the Hindu Kush. On his way east, he founded the city of Alexandria Ariana, now Jera. His army of 30,000 men is subjected to inclement weather, rain, snow, and blizzards, lack of oxygen, and crossing places where the passage was so narrow that the army marched in single file for more than 15 kilometers. In the spring of 326 BC, they arrived in the Indus Valley, in present-day Pakistan. The Indo-king Poros, who had arrived earlier, on the banks of the Vitasta River. He positioned himself in front of Alexander's army and prepared to repel any attempt to cross. Poros had an ace up his sleeve. That would totally surprise the Macedonians. 200 war elephants, whose presence threatened to render the Greek cavalry useless because of the fear that the pachyderms caused to their mounts. At the Battle of Hydaspes, the Indian king attacked Alexander with an army of 50,000 men and war elephants. It was a bloody and balanced battle for a long time. But in the end, the conquerors from the west triumphed. It was the last great battle they fought. The contest was the most difficult in which the Macedonians had ever fought. The Battle of Hydaspes affected the courage of the Macedonians and made them decide not to advance any further into India. Alexander was overwhelmed with disappointment and anger. But finally, at the insistence of his troops, he relented and gave orders to break camp. Alexander's army was tired, weary of being away from their parents and families for more than 8 years, and increasingly fed up with Alexander's dictatorial leadership. They had come to Asia with the purpose of avenging the injustices the Persian king had committed against the Macedonians. So what were they doing there but magnifying Alexander's empire without taking anything in return? Alexander's men realized that he would never stop. They set off at that moment down the river, raiding the cities near the shores, and subduing them all. Then he came to the walled city of Mali. Alexander thought to take it by assault, but one of the seers came to him and informed him that a great danger to his person had been revealed to him. He begged Alexander not to attack the city. The king scolded him for discouraging the enthusiasm of the soldiers, and then disposed his army for the attack and went in person to the city, eager to reduce it by force. Alexander stationed his infantry in a ring around the outer defenses. He had ladders placed for a climb around the fort. But in this, the Macedonians were too slow, so Alexander himself is the first to climb to the top, fighting the enemy left and right until suddenly he is left alone. At that moment, instead of jumping down to rejoin his men, he leaps forward into the enemy fortress, where in hand-to-hand combat, he fights for his life. The horrified Macedonians run for the walls, but only 3 of them manage to join Alexander inside the fortress. But then Alexander himself is hit by an arrow that penetrates his breastplate and his right lung. Alexander's army finally manages to scale the walls and witnesses an impossible sight, where their invincible leader lies on the ground in a pool of blood. Alexander would then slowly recover over the next 2 years. From there on, Alexander and his army begin their return to Greece. But Alexander, although he had agreed to give up the conquest of India, does not make it easy for them. Instead of pursuing a coastal route, he insists on going to the east, crossing the desert of Gadrotia, in the current south of Iran, one of the most intimidating places on earth for its scorching heat and its very deep sands. It is believed that Alexander chose to cross this inhospitable desert instead of having embarked his men back home to punish them for having refused to accompany him in his conquest of the East. They paid for their disloyalty with their lives. 25,000 men, more than 3/4 of Alexander's force, perish in the desert. When Alexander finally reached Babylon, he had lost more men than in any battle. But he returned to Persia as a much more ruthless lawgiver. When his close friend Hephaestion died in 324 BC, Alexander lashed out in all directions, blaming innocents for his friend's death. Alexander never recovered from this death. Alexander rested in Babylon, planning a possible conquest of Arabia. Then, in June of 323, Alexander contracts a fever that lasts 12 days. He gradually loses the mobility of his body, and a few days before his 33rd birthday, the greatest conqueror ever known dies. It is believed that he may have suffered from malaria or typhoid fever. Roxana was pregnant with his child, but Alexander did not name a successor. On his deathbed, when Alexander was asked who would inherit the empire, he replied, "The strongest." A bitter struggle for his succession began in Greece. The vast kingdom that Alexander struggled to build over a period of 12 years was eventually divided among more than 20 rulers. The death of Alexander the Great put an end to a conquest never equaled by any warrior at any time in history. For centuries, Alexander's body rested in the city of Alexandria. It was probably one of the most sacred relics of the Roman Empire. After his death, Alexander was worshipped as a god. With great devotion, Julius Caesar went to pay homage to his dead hero. But in the 4th century AD, something happened and the tomb disappeared. Since then, Alexander's tomb has been one of the holy grails of archaeology. Although Alexander's remains may have been lost to history, his legacy lives on. His brilliant tactics of war are still studied in military academies. The art of war is only one part of Alexander's legacy. He also established new trade routes. He forged the foundations of cultural relations between East and West, spread Greek culture across 3 continents, as far as India, and was the first European world ruler in history. Alexander conquered more than half of the Earth's sphere and built the greatest empire in history, although his cruelty knew no bounds. In his short life, Alexander walked a fine line between genius and madness. His personal biographer made sure that he was remembered for his military prowess, which is why, more than 2,000 years later, he is still known as Alexander the Great.